So is that all making sense so far? Whether it's useful or not? Detect some suspicion, but let's be happy with it making sense so far. Okay, I'm going to now skip that. I'll now move on to the other side of the market, which is producers. So producers are selling goods. They want to make a profit. They want to maximize their profits. And to sell goods, they've got to make them. They've got to pay for labor, machines, materials. If you're making biscuits, you've got to buy the flour, you've got to bake them and everything else. So you've got to cover your costs and make a profit. And the assumption here, which it works very well for the market as a whole, it doesn't work quite so well for individual producers, but I'm going to take it as assumption, is that every additional unit that you make of beer or biscuits, whatever it is that you're producing, costs more than the last unit. So I don't know, let's give an example. Suppose you were a farmer and you're producing corn or whatever. And the amount that you can produce depends on how much fertilizer you use. If you want to make more, produce more corn, use more fertilizer. And that works for a while, but after a while the sort of additional yield of corn you get from an additional unit of fertilizer begins to fall. Yeah? To put another way, what that means is the costs required to produce an additional unit are going up. You know, you're spending £10 on each unit of fertilizer, but you're getting less and less additional units of corn. So the phrase for that is increasing marginal costs. It costs more to produce the good as production goes up. This is a short-term perspective, a static a snapshot. It changes over the longer term, but just a point in time. As you increase output, your costs go up. Or maybe you're producing biscuits and you want to produce more. You've got to have 2 shifts rather than 1. You've got to have staff running on overtime. You've got to pay them more if they're working overtime. Your costs go up, and so on. So the idea is, in the same way as marginal utility decline as you consume more, marginal costs increase as you produce more. So this is a picture of a supply curve. How much producers of whatever this commodity is are prepared to produce at different prices. When the price is low, they don't produce very much. When the price is high, they produce more. And in the same way as for the demand curve, you can relate the shape of that supply curve to this notion of marginal cost. So I'll simply change the x-axis and labeled it now marginal cost. This is an indication of the cost that they incur to produce an additional unit of this commodity. So down here, the height of that curve is a representation of the additional cost to produce another unit. The additional cost to produce another unit here is less than the price. You can produce more corn, you've got to spend more money to produce more corn, but you can sell it and still make a profit. So you produce more corn. You get up here, yes, you can produce more corn, but the amount of money you spend on producing an additional unit of corn is more than your price you're going to get in the market. So you wouldn't do it. So you would end up here. And at that point, the additional unit to produce, additional cost to produce an additional unit of whatever it is equal to the market price. You won't go any further. Make sense? So that is a sort of, again, an idealization of the behavior of an individual firm. In practice, it won't be a straight line, it will be lumpy and all sorts of things, but what we're interested more is the behavior of firms as a whole in the entire market. So if you added up the way that the behavior of each of these individual firms in a market, you get a market supply curve. The total amount of this good, corn, biscuits, beer, or whatever, that is produced at different market prices. When the price is low, they produce more, when is produced less, and when the price is high, they produce more. Yeah? So again, we can do something similar. Suppose you're producing this quantity at that price. Okay? So that rectangle there is a measure of the amount of money that these producers are getting. They're producing Q, 100 tons of corn at price P, £10 a ton. They're getting £1,000. That's a measure of the revenue they get from selling this good on the market. They're having to incur costs to produce that corn for their labour, their machinery, their equipment, their fuel and whatever. The cost that they incur is given by the area under that curve. The marginal cost to produce the first unit plus the marginal cost to produce the second unit, and so on and so on and so on. So if you subtract the cost from the revenue, you get that triangle there. That is a measure of the benefits that producers get from participating in this market, in the same way as you have the measure of the benefits that consumers got. You think of it as profits. But the technical term is producer surplus. Okay, so now we've got a measure of the benefits that consumers got from being in this market and a measure of the benefits that producers get, both in money terms. First called consumer surplus, second called producer surplus. Skip that. Now let's put the two together. We've got a demand and a supply curve for this commodity, corn or whatever. And the market price will be determined by the interaction between the two, between consumers and producers. Let's for a moment assume the market price is here, PL. At that price, consumers are prepared to buy that amount of corn, following the logic that I showed you earlier. But at that price, producers are only prepared to sell that amount of corn. I don't want to sell any more, because they'll make a loss if they sold any more. So we've got a shortage. Consumers are demanding more of this stuff than producers are prepared to produce at this price. So what producers will realize is that they have an incentive to increase the output, raise the price, because they can sell that. There's a demand out there for this additional corn or whatever. So they will increase output, price will rise, will move from here up to here, and will eventually get to this point here, where demand and supply are equalized. We'll get to this point here. It will move towards so-called equilibrium. The market will clear. All the goods available to be sold will be purchased. Producers will just be breaking even in that last good sold, and consumers will be happy. All right. So you've got a shortage being eliminated through the interaction between supply and demand. Or the same way, you could have a surplus in the market, which would also be eliminated. So suppose the price was here. At that price, consumers would demand no more than that. Suppliers are prepared to sell that, a bigger quantity at that price. But they can't find anybody to buy it. There's a surplus on the market. They can only reduce that surplus by producing less and reducing the price. So they move back down here, they produce less, and again we'll move towards an equilibrium point where supply and demand matched. So the logic is, in this competitive market, there's a tendency to equilibrium, clearing the market. Right, so having shown this tendency to equilibrium, let's now go back to this social surplus idea. So I showed you the consumer surplus in this market which was given by the area of that triangle between 0 and the quantity sold. And the producer surplus in that market was given by the area of that triangle. The sum of the two is called the social surplus. Two producers and consumers in this market, assuming nobody else is affected by this activity. And the argument is a competitive market with lots of producers, lots of consumers, no information problems and so on, can maximize that. So to summarize, social surplus is a measure of the net benefits obtained from an activity by all those affected by that activity. Consumer surplus is the difference between the amount that consumers are willing and able to pay for a good or service, which is given by the demand curve, and the amount they actually pay, which is the price. The producer surplus is the difference between what producers are willing and able to supply a good for, which is given by the supply curve, and the price they receive. Assuming no one else is affected, social surplus is given by the sum of the two, consumer surplus plus producer surplus. And the argument is competitive markets can maximize that. And what this is saying is that people are acting in their own self-interest. Consumers are just making decisions based upon what they do or do not want to buy and to maximize their utility. Producers are making decisions on the basis of maximizing their own profits. No one here is trying to be altruistic or help anybody else. They're acting in their own self-interest in a competitive market. But if these conditions hold, we end up in a situation where the consumer benefits are maximized, the producer benefits are maximized, this thing called social surplus is maximized. That's an efficient outcome. It's making the best use of resources. Now, if we were intervening in that market by, for example, putting a price ceiling in, that might benefit some groups who will be able to get the goods at a lower price. But overall, consumer surplus and producer surplus will be less than it would be if we just left the market alone, unregulated. So the argument here is that a competitive market meeting these conditions can maximize social surplus, lead to an efficient outcome. And in practice, many, if not most, are not perfectly competitive. Many, if not most, markets are a long way from this idealized market. Some are closer to the ideal than others. If they're a long way from the ideal, if they're really not functioning at all well, for various reasons, then that's a strong rationale for intervening in some way, in trying to improve competition, regulating the side effects of producing bread which are affecting other third parties, for example, or whatever. So the existence of problems in markets, which I'm going to be talking about next week, is a rationale for intervention, government intervention, to improve economic efficiency. As I said earlier, there are other rationales for intervening in these markets as well, such as improving fairness. So whether or not the market is efficient, you still might want to intervene to achieve certain other goals. But you want to consider what the effect will be on economic efficiency. You might want to impose a price ceiling in a relatively competitive market because you think it will improve, it will allow low-income groups to access this good at lower prices. Maybe it will. But it will have other effects as well, and it will lower economic efficiency overall. And you need to consider what those trade-offs are. I'm done. Everybody's baffled. All right, so questions? You first, yeah.
As far as I remember correctly,
Yeah.
number. But my question is that is there a way to calculate which technology ensure the economic efficiency? For example, government wants to invest in some kind of technology, and there's a choice, A technology or B technology. So, is there a way to show the effect of these technologies in terms of the supply and demand curve to calculate?
Well, I guess the first thing, that this is an idealized static picture of a market. Over time, these curves will change. Technology will improve, cost of inputs will change, and so on. So maybe technological change will make it cheaper to produce corn. Okay, so that means you can produce the same quantity of corn for a lower price. That technological change might occur in the market, or you might want to subsidize R&D into agricultural technologies to improve that. And that, we'll come on to that next week. There's a strong rationale for subsidizing R&D from this perspective. But again, there will be trade-offs because the certain groups have a strong interest in getting subsidies for their own technologies or for their own firms or whatever. So the policymaker's got to choose between the potential aggregate social benefits of a subsidy scheme versus potential inefficiencies of that subsidy scheme and money being captured by interest groups and so on. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Maybe to add on that question, they usually use like a traditional cost-benefit analysis, and it depends. I think it could be more specific again what they get the price by how to adopt something and how to adopt the cost. But I will use like cost-benefit analysis related with that.
Cost-benefit analysis is powerful and useful in some instances, but it is always uncertain, and it becomes particularly difficult where you're trying to value impacts that are not in a market. So I showed consumer impacts and producer impacts there, which you can value, you can put a number to, because you can estimate those demand curves and supply curves. Next week we're going to talk about market failures. One type of market failure is effects on third parties, for example through pollution, health effects, damaging ecosystems. Trying to put a value on that is a wholly different situation. Very challenging and very controversial. Yeah?
Coming back to Damien's question about the Amazon book example, how do you decide where to draw your ad load on the system? Like, how do you decide who's the relevant third-party actor?
Yeah. That is a good question. It's called what's the phrase? Standing in cost-benefit analysis is who has standing. Is it? I mean, for example, you might be doing this at a state level or a local level, and you might be evaluating the costs and the benefits of investing in a new football stadium, which is going to bring a lot of economic activity to your local area, lots of benefits. But some of the money for that stadium is coming from taxpayers in the country as a whole, outside your local area. So is that part of your cost-benefit analysis or not? Do you look at the aggregate social benefits for the economy as a whole, or just those for your local area? Or maybe the thing that you're considering has impacts beyond your nation-state boundaries, particularly like pollution, transboundary pollution. Do you value that? So I think all those values should, if you're presenting an analysis, you should really present all those impacts and value them if you can. And it's up to decision makers as to which ones are taken into account, really. But the technical term for that in the specific area of cost-benefit analysis is standing. Who has standing in the analysis? Okay. Yeah?
How do the government or policymakers measure the social surplus after implementing a certain policy? Just like I feel like in my local area where I came from, I don't feel that someone measuring the consumer surplus after implementing a local policy?
Right. Well, typically it would be done before rather than after, I guess.
So like after there's no one
And often it's not done at all.
like after.
How do you measure after? Well, if you were to measure after, if
Like
you
the effect.
if you could estimate the changes in the price of different goods and services, and estimate the effects on different groups, you should be able to put a value to that, comparing it with what happened before. But quantifying any of these things is very difficult. I mean, what I've shown here is a nice conceptual illustration with straight lines and triangles shaded in, but trying to do that and actually put a number to it in reality is pretty challenging. It's what cost-benefit analysis does, but it's by no means straightforward and often very uncertain and contested.
So like
Yeah.
they don't actually get the like measuring the effect of that, like the effect on the consumers or whatever.
Often not. You got the challenge of isolating the effect of whatever the policy is from the effect of other things that have changed at the same time. I've subsidised insulation measures in housing in the UK. What are the costs and benefits of that measure? Well, at the same time, the price of gas has changed when the economy's gone into recession. So you've got to extract the impact of your policy from the other factors which have affected investment in insulation in housing at the same time. So it's methodologically quite challenging.
Like for example, in my local area, there's a policy to ban plastic. So it affected like the use of plastic straws
Mhm.
in the, for example, fast food chains. So like consumers don't get plastic straws anymore. And it's kind of convenient if you like get it for takeout and you won't have the straw.
Uh-huh.
And then they won't give you any alternatives. And it's in the same price. And even if you don't get the drink, it will be the same price because it's like a set meal. So like somehow there's a disadvantage of the consumer part and an advantage to the producer part. But then like no one cares if like the consumer is being in disadvantage because the policy will focus on the environmental part.
All right. Yeah.
So like I'm thinking like what should be done in that case?
Well, what should be done now? I mean, what should have been done when the policy was being developed was to consider what those different impacts might be and trade them off. Doesn't sound like a huge loss to the consumer for me, but that's a value that I'm placing on that situation. So, but the point of an analysis would be to estimate those different impacts on different groups from what is being proposed. We will go through this again on Wednesday. We'll simulate a market, hoping that will make it a bit clearer. Any more questions before we wrap up? Okay, thank you.